Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you my September reading wrap up, which is going to include a wrap up for the readathon Monsterathon that happened the entire month of September. So I've got about 14 books to talk to you about today, so we're going to try and keep this as quick and snappy as we can. I actually already filmed this and the audio got like completely corrupted. It was literally just me being like so we're going to try again and hopefully you can actually hear me this time. First things first, I do have a new tattoo. It's here, it's not finished, I'll show you when it's fully done, but you might see it in the corner of your eye. No, you're not going insane, I do indeed have some new ink on the old body. So we're going to go in the order that I read these books and I will just flag when they are for a Monsterathon prompt. I finished 9 out of 10 of the Monsterathon prompts. The only one I didn't get to was read a graphic novel. Okay, so the first book that I finished in the month of September was Rather Weird by Andrew Caldecott, and this counted as my prompt for the Beasts for Monsterathon, which was read a book with plant or animal based monsters. I don't want to go into too much detail about that for this book because I think it might spoil some things for you, but Rather Weird is kind of a historical fiction with a magical realism slant to it. It's about the wonderful town of Rather Weird, which has been kind of outside of governmental control for quite a few years, going back like decades and indeed potentially centuries. Yeah, centuries, like 4.5 centuries on, we go and visit this town, and it's about an outsider who comes in to be one of the teachers at the school, and he starts to discover all these mysterious and weird things going on, and it's generally very creepy and interesting and fun, and there's this whole like conspiracy happening, and it definitely has like magical elements, and it's really interesting. I really enjoyed the mix of the deep historical one set in the Elizabethan era to the semi-modern day. It's not fully modern day, it's kind of like 50s, and I did find this very spooky and atmospheric and really engaging, and it was one of quite a few books this month where I just like, once I hit the halfway point, I kind of had to sit and just finish it in one go, and I think I stayed up until like 2 AM finishing this book, so that gives you an indication of like how captivated I was towards the end of it. Criticism wise, I would say this has got a huge cast of characters, and there are occasionally points where you struggle to tell them apart, and it's difficult to keep in your head like who's on what side, who knows what. There's just a lot of information. It is part of a series, and I'm definitely going to continue with the series, but I'm not like jumping to go get the next book. I think it would be fun to leave this for a bit and then kind of get back into the world in a few months time. Really entertaining, some amazing scenes, really cool stuff happens in it. The next book I finished was The History of Bees by Maja Lund. This was for like a book that's been recommended a lot, the Angry Mob prompt for Monsterathon, and it's a combination of dystopian fiction and historical fiction. And basically it follows 3 different timelines. It's England in 1851, United States in 2007, and China in 2098, and it's basically about the disappearance of the bees and then the effect this has on food shortages because there are no bees to pollinate any of the plants, so we do indeed run out of food. I personally found the 3 timeline aspect of it like an interesting thing at the beginning, but then I wasn't actually as invested in the earliest timeline, the one that's set kind of historically, which was about like the creation of some of the hives that like turned beekeeping from this sort of hobby into something that could be industrialized and made much bigger. Personally, I just wasn't very invested in those characters, and like with so many dystopian fiction, I don't think it ended particularly strongly. I don't think many dystopian fictions can end strongly. To be honest, that's a complaint that's going to come up a few times because I read a couple of dystopian fictions this month and I don't think any of them ended very well. But having said that, I did really enjoy this book. This was another like stay up until 2 AM to finish it because I was really like invested in what was going on, even if it was a bit of a letdown towards the end. And it was a really cool concept, this idea that we reach a stage where we basically have to hire people to pollinate plants for us because we've killed off all the bees. I would have liked more expansion on the bee stuff as well. I've read a few books about bees now and I would have enjoyed a little bit more information on that front. It felt a little bit lacking, but really cool, really interesting, very fascinating topic and kind of subject matter, and I can see why it is so widely acclaimed. It's won a lot of prizes and the craft from the writing is very good. Okay, then I read the book The Corset by Laura Purcell, and this was for the prompt of monstrous humans, something like that. Basically it has some bad guys in it. This is a historical fiction, and this follows the story of 2 women, one who is like a rich heiress who uses her money to fund charities specifically looking at the poor working class women who are in prisons, and then we have our prisoner who is Ruth, who has been accused of murder, and she's telling her story to Dorothea, the rich one, and it's about the 2 running parallel. At About the halfway point, I wasn't actually that bothered by Dorothea, but then she comes into her own and has a really nice character arc. So actually by the end of it, I was fully invested in both characters. If anything, this might be one of my favourite books from this month. I've found it absolutely fascinating. Dorothea has some really interesting bits talking about phrenology, which is the Victorian theories that basically the shape of a person's skull dictated a lot about what kind of a human being they would be like, and you could have the ability to like predict criminal behaviour based on skull and brain size and things like that. I would have liked a fraction more information about that, but I'm a nerd who really likes that kind of thing, so I don't think I would have been happy without a lot more information in it. I really enjoyed, so Ruth is a working class girl who works stitching. She's got a knack for embroidery, and I really appreciated all the detail in that, because embroidery is something that I personally have done in the past and do quite a lot. Crafting is something that was quite big in my family. We really enjoyed stitching and things like that, so I really enjoyed that element. And there was the faintest hint of kind of magical realism to this book, this idea that there might be something a little bit supernatural going on. I loved that element, thought it was so cool and fascinating. There's a little bit of a couple of funky twists at the end, which again I really enjoyed. I think this is a stunning book, and I definitely want to read more from Laura Purcell in the future. I think historical thriller might be my new like favourite subgenre of historical fiction. I just think it works so well. Then for the prompt of The Haunts, which was really a book with the dead or undead, I read Love Minus 80 by Will Mackintosh. This was such a like unexpected little gem this month. I have had this on my shelf for damn near a year, and I've been putting it off completely, and just I finally picked it up and I really enjoyed it. Basically, it's set in this kind of future society, future world where technology has progressed, and we have the ability to freeze people and bring them back for very brief windows of time, and most life insurances include this in them. But if you're a relatively attractive human being, mainly women, we'll be honest, and you don't have a decent life insurance, then what happens is you basically get put into these almost like weird dating frozen bits where very rich bachelors can pay to spend like 5 minutes with you at a time to chat with you, and then if they like you they can pay to basically resurrect you, and it's called like the Bridesicle site, and the idea is that you can buy like previously dead frozen women who they'll bring back to life to be your brides. It's really creepy, and the whole point of the book is that it's discussing that like creepiness, but the main drama and kind of plot focuses on this young woman who gets hit in a hit and run and killed, and then it's about her killer, or the guy who accidentally hit her, basically going to visit her to try and atone for his actions, and then about kind of their discussion of the whole culture surrounding it through that. And there's some really fascinating characters, and I thought the world building in this was absolutely amazing. I think this came out before live streaming was particularly popular on social media, but it has this like version of live streaming where rather than like us holding the screen and people watching in, people have like floating drone type screens where they can come and like hang around you and watch you constantly, and you have the ability to like block certain people can have like multiple conversations going on by like sub-vocalizing. People hire life coaches to literally like feed them lines so that they're wittier and cooler and more interesting in real life, and it's just such a cool fun world. As with kind of the dystopian fiction, this sort of speculative fiction concept didn't end the strongest in the world. I wasn't overly bothered by the finale, but I thought really cool world building, really fun and interesting ideas, and some fantastic characters, so I definitely recommend this one. Like, I've not heard anybody mention this book. It's just kind of fallen by the wayside, and I totally recommend it. Oh my god, we've got so many books left to go. Okay. Another one that I read for Monsterathon, this was for The Conspiracies, which was read a robot sci-fi alien book, and I read War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This is my last of the big four H.G. Wells to read, and whilst I did enjoy it, it's not my favourite H.G. Wells. Having said that, that's like saying like this isn't my favourite kind of chocolate bar. I still absolutely love it, and I'm definitely not going to turn it down. Like, I think Wells is one of my new all-time favourite authors. I think his work is absolutely fantastic. This is no different, but I think for me personally, H.G. Wells works best when he's talking about biological aspects rather than technological. So War of the Worlds, in case you didn't know, is basically the original alien invasion fiction. It's set in Victorian England, which is obviously when H.G. Wells was writing, and it's when Martians invade. Absolutely cool, amazing, such fun with like the different ideas of technology and trying to predict where we might be. The biology aspects of the aliens that he goes into a bit later, really fun and cool, and the ending is just so great. Like, I'm gonna not mention it because I think I've mentioned it on this channel before. and I hope I haven't spoiled it for anybody, but like the ending is wicked. This has been made into a movie in the past several times. The movies suck, but they are now, BBC is doing like a mini series set in the actual Victorian England when this book was written, with the alien invasion there, and I think it works so much better then because the tech was so far removed from what the aliens have in the story that I just think it makes it far more powerful. I'd really recommend this. I actually listened to it on audiobook and I think that that's a wicked way of doing it as well. H.G. Wells is great. I just think The Island of Dr. Moreau is slightly better. Sorry. Then I read Magic Bitter, Magic Sweet by Charlie N. Holmberg. So Charlie N. Holmberg wrote the Paper Magician trilogy, which I read last year and really enjoyed, but enjoyed in that kind of fluffy, light YA. The plot and the characters aren't great, but the world building is kind of fun, kind of a way, and I was kind of hoping for the same thing from this one, and it really fell flat for me. Magic Bitter, Magic Sweet is about a woman who can bake magic into like pastries and sweets and various baked goods, and then her village gets taken over by marauders and they sell her into slavery, and then it turns out she has this like really dark and mysterious past that she can't remember, and it all kind of ensues from there. There were some like vague hints of fairy tale retellings in it. Honestly, it was just like a weird bundle mishmash of a bunch of stuff, and I wasn't overly bothered by any of it. I don't think the world building was very strong, and I don't think Charlie N. Holmberg is very good at plot and characters, to be honest. They just seem like a series of disjointed random things, so I'm definitely not going to continue in the series. I've not written her, I don't actually know, them off completely, because they do have a few other series that could be interesting, and I did enjoy The Paper Magician, and I think like when they get their world building spot on, they have some really cool and fun ideas that they play with. I loved the magic system in The Paper Magicians. It's just this particular one for Magic Bitter, Magic Sweet didn't hit the mark for me. Oh, this was for Chimera for the Monsterathon prompt, which was like a multiple genre book, which honestly like any of these could have fitted into. Then I went on holiday, and I had such a good time reading on holiday. Andy and I went and just sat by the beach and read for hours and hours and hours, and by the pool just reading. So I have like 5 books that I read on holiday to talk about. So the first one is A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. This is book 2 of the London series. This was for the prompt of Sacrifice, which was a book that features in somebody else's unhaul video, and Jess nevertheless has just unhauled this kind of recently, so thank you, Jess. That meant I could read it. This is good. I've been meaning to read it. This is book 2 of a trilogy, and I know a lot of people don't like book 2s in general in trilogies because kind of not much really ever happens in them, if we're entirely honest. Like, book 1 sets up your initial big bad and introduces you to a bunch of characters in the world. Book 2 is then setting up a whole load of different sort of threads and ideas and things that then will be resolved in book 3, so it's kind of a bit of a nothing book in a lot of people's eyes, and this one is no exception. Not a crazy amount happens. However, I love the characters and the world in this trilogy so much that I was totally content to just hang out with them. So the London series is basically kind of a fantasy book where there are multiple different Londons in like parallel universes that have different levels of magic. R1 has no magic and barely features in the story, and then you have Red London, which is full of magic, and White London, where magic is there but it's a bit twisted and strange and things have gone a bit wrong. White London features very heavily in the first book, and then you get snippets of that in the second book, but really the second book is just more time kind of exploring the main character Kel's Red London and getting to find out more about the magic system, the characters. We get to visit Lila, who's an amazing character from the first book again. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it. This is definitely a booktube darling, so a lot of people have heard about this book before anyway. Like, V.E. Schwab is also a huge booktube darling, and I really enjoyed this. I had such a good time. I was so content just like hanging out on Lila's pirate ship, or like hanging out with Kel in the royal court. There's some really fun like magic competitions. Everything's pretty great, so I had a fantastic time with this book. Now we have a brand new favourite, like all-time favourite, and that is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This was for the prompt of read a monstrously long book because it needed 400 plus pages, and this one sits at the 500 odd mark. This is a classic by, as you can see, Anne Bronte, one of the Bronte sisters, probably the least well-known Bronte sister, and it tells the tale of a woman who comes into a village, and there's kind of a scandal that follows her, and this gentleman is kind of courting her, and then when the scandal breaks that she might have some kind of relationship with another gentleman who's her landlord in the village, she basically gives her courter her diary, which details actually the reality of what's happening, which is that her landlord is her brother, who is helping her get out of like a really bad situation with a abusive husband, and she's run away. Now, the reason why this book was so iconic at the time and has stood the test of time is it's like one of the original feminist texts, because it talks very openly about abusive relationships, the idea of the husband being a drunkard and emotionally manipulative and distant, and then doing some very horrible emotional things later. There's adultery and various things like that, and it was the first time that was like openly addressed really clearly, and in such a way that was so condemning of the man in literature, kind of publicly. So Anne Bronte was really making waves at that point, because oh damn, your main character Helen like does not hold back. She is brutal with how she talks about the men in her life, and it's not just her husband. Basically every male in this book more or less is kind of a fairly despicable creature, apart from her brother and potentially kind of her suitor, but honestly I wasn't psyched about him either. He had a bit of a temper. I wasn't a big fan of his. It's witty, it's clever, it's so like still so relevant today, and talks about so many interesting things, and has like so much happening in it, and it really doesn't feel like that kind of classic in the sort of bogged down sense. So I had a great time with this. I'd really recommend it. It's my first Bronte, and it's a firm favourite, like literally favourite book of the year. Might make it onto my all-time favourite books list. Just absolutely adored it. We're getting there, guys. We're about halfway through. We can do this. Oh, more than halfway. God, end is in sight. Okay, then I read The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. This is a non-fiction. It was not for Monsterathon. I just read it because I wanted to read it. And it basically details there was a robbery in Tring Museum where somebody broke in and stole a huge collection of rare stuffed birds of paradise. And the reason why they stole them is because the feathers on these birds of paradise are worth a lot. And we're talking like a lot of money in the fly fishing world. So this book is a combination of looking at the history of collecting the birds of paradise. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was one of the scientists who like pioneered sort of the idea of evolution and natural selection, and he was only just behind Darwin in his theories and came up with a lot of them independent to Darwin. Whilst Darwin was in the Galapagos, he was in the Amazon rainforest doing very similar work. So it kind of details his history, and then the Victorian era, where birds of paradise were it's like stuffed birds of paradise were essentially considered almost like trinkets and jewelry that you would adorn your hats with, and it became a huge trade that ended up with the massacring of tens of thousands of birds for the selling of their carcasses, which is very sad and very intense. And then it goes on to fly fishing being kind of the next wave that now uses these feathers, and basically Edwin Rist broke into Tring Museum in a very bold move and stole all of these birds to then try and sell them on. This book is sort of detailing that entire thing, and then the author goes off and does his own exploration of what happened to do with the Edwin Rist case, and sort of what happened to the birds that were stolen subsequently afterwards, and trying to continue the work of the police. I personally found the stuff before we get to know about the author's own personal journey with Edwin Rist much more interesting, and I wasn't overly psyched by Kirk Wallace Johnson's like self-insertion later. However, I know a lot of people have enjoyed that part of it, and like it wasn't that it wasn't good, I just didn't enjoy it as much as the initial bit. I personally would have been more than happy to keep hanging out in Victorian England or know more about maybe some other break-ins that had happened, because this was like a semi-common problem at the time where a lot of these collections are worth a lot of money, but the museums don't have the funds to guard them appropriately because they're only worth a lot of money to a very small percentage of people, but those people are potentially very desperate and willing to do a lot to get them. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Interesting book, definitely would recommend it. Personally didn't like the way it ended. Then I read another book, and this is The Wall by John Lancaster. Again, I still read this on holiday, and this was not for Monsterathon. I just read it. I picked it up actually in the airport. This is supposed to be the 1984 of our generation. I think that's personally giving it more praise than it deserves, but it was a very interesting dystopian fiction and quite short, so I would recommend it to people to give it a bit of a go. Basically, it sets the idea of a world that is completely racked with climate change and global warming and general natural disasters, and the UK, which is relatively stable in comparison to lots of the rest of the world, has decided to put a giant ass wall around our entire coastal line, which now it is mandatory that you have to go and do guard duty on it for 2 years in the kind of next generation. So this book is detailing this one particular character's time on the wall, and then a series of things that happen kind of after that and with that. Anybody who's outside the wall is termed like the others, and it's generally a discussion about like us versus them and sort of isolation and group mentality. It is interesting, but I personally found the narrator's voice not the most enjoyable, and the first like 6 or 7 chapters are just talking about how cold and boring it is on the wall, which makes for quite boring reading, funnily enough. So I wasn't overly fussed about that. I personally would have liked, again, which is so often the case with anything dystopian that I read, I wanted more from the world building. If you're gonna do dystopian fiction, I kind of don't really care that much about your plot. I want to know more about what happened in the world. I really want you to like thought game this out for me, and John Lancaster doesn't do that. It's a little bit more plot driven. However, that's totally fine. You know, there are people out there who are going to like that. I still enjoyed reading it. I just wanted it to do a little bit more. And once again, it didn't end great. Dystopian fiction just kind of has to like end, and there's no real resolution because the whole point to it is that the world's completely fucked. So like you can't fix it, so it just kind of ends. And I personally wasn't bothered by its endpoint, but again, still a really good read, a really fun read. I think I gave it like 7 out of 10. So even though I have these like little gripes and complaints about it, it's not that it wasn't interesting. Does that make sense? Then I read A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab, and this is book 3. So basically, after finishing A Gathering of Shadows, I did something that I don't normally do when I'm reading a series, and that was I was so into the world at the end of A Gathering of Shadows, I basically went out and bought the next book in the series immediately. I bought it on my Kindle and I started reading it on holiday, although I finished it when I got back home. The reason why I finished it when I got back home was because I really didn't like the way that the trilogy ended. I'm not going to say a crazy amount on here because obviously I don't want to spoil anything, but basically, as far as I was concerned, the last book, V.E. Schwab had built so much up and kind of built this house of cards that then she couldn't possibly like contain everything that she's done, and the whole thing kind of came tumbling down. There are a lot of plot points and threads that just went nowhere and felt like that they were padding. I wasn't particularly interested in a lot of it. It felt very like rushed and chaotic and a bit nonsensical, and then the ending did a very like classic Lord of the Rings, let's keep this drifting on for another 100 pages that it doesn't need, and it felt like every single character who kind of made it to the end had at least 2 or 3 like goodbye chapters with them, which honest to God, I was there at the end just like, just get on the boat, just get on the boat and go, just oh my god, we're done, big bad is dead, will you just like, we're done, the end, I'll write it for you, for God's sake, woman. So from that perspective, I think that it was a very, very weak ending to what could have been a very strong trilogy. I still like the characters, she can still has a good writing style. I wasn't like hating every second of it as I was reading it. I just wanted more from it, you know? So I think I gave it like 6 out of 10 or 5. It's not horrendous, but I feel like she could have done more. And then I had 2 more books, we're nearly there. These were both featured in my October TBR as still currently reading, but I did manage to get both of them finished in September. This is what happens when you film like a solid week before stuff goes out. But one of them is Mary Roach's Stiff. This is a non-fiction looking at the science behind human cadavers and what happens to us after we die when you donate your body to science. So some examples include obviously details about organ donation and what happens there, but also for some of it, it includes things like the fact that dead bodies often become crash test dummies or can end up on body farms or a whole variety of other things. It also details like historical instances of cannibalism and a whole bunch of other things like that. Mary Roach's books have a tendency, like each chapter focuses on a slightly different thing within the overall topic that she's talking about, and whilst I think that her writing is fantastic and generally very good and very interesting, and I read this one very quickly, she relies a lot on humour, which occasionally misses the mark for me personally, because humour is very, very subjective. So sometimes things that others find funny, I don't personally. This is also quite an old book now. It was written in 2003, so some of the like work in the kind of the literary canon about non-fiction and death, for example Caitlin Doughty's work, has since moved the general public's like knowledge about death on a little bit more, so some of this felt quite repetitive just because I've read it in other books, which is not Mary Roach's fault. She was writing this very, very, very early, like 16 odd years ago. Also because of that, some of it's obviously going to be a little bit out of date. That's what happens when you read an old non-fiction. Still would highly recommend it. I think Mary Roach is a fantastic non-fiction author. This was so fascinating, and I have so many like random gory horrific tidbits of information I can now bust out, and like social gatherings and really really freak people out with, and it's so much fun. So I definitely recommend this one. And then my last book that I read in September, I finally did it. I finally finished Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. I started this book now like 3 years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago basically. I read about half of it, put it down, and then couldn't pick it back up again, just left it too long, and it has appeared on numerous TBRs since that point as like this, I am finally going to get back to that book and finish it, and it's just been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and I finally did it. The way I did it was I listened to it on audiobook, and I'd really recommend that. It's a fantastic audiobook. As the name suggests, it is a non-fiction book that is basically detailing the history of humankind, going all the way back to when we were hanging out with Neanderthals and like Homo erectus and all of those kind of other human species, all the way up to modern day, and a brief discussion of where we're going now. It's talking about big sweeping like global revolutions on a species level rather than the smaller ones. So it has kind of 3 major revolutions it talks about. This is the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, and then the scientific revolution, and these being huge jumping points where humankind as a species advanced and became more prolific on Earth. As with a book this size, there are going to be sections which are slightly more interesting than others, dependent on your personal preference. I really enjoyed the bits that were talking about like almost prehistory and the archaeological stuff and the anthropological stuff going back like quite far, and then some of the stuff more to do in the like scientific revolution. I wasn't as bothered by some of the modern day stuff, but I know there are going to be people out there who will have around. This book is really one that has like something for everybody, because it spans such a huge length of time and goes into so much detail. You can so clearly tell it's very well researched, and just has just a wealth of information. So I would really recommend it. But I think everybody knows now that Yuval Noah Harari is like solid for non-fiction. This isn't really like a controversial opinion. And that's it. I did it again. I filmed it again. We did it, and we did it before the sunset. I'm so proud of me. I didn't think I was gonna get through that. Oh my god, that's so many books in 1 month, and so many long books. I think the last time I read this many books in 1 month, they were much shorter. Oh shoot, there's another one. Oh, we were so close. Okay, yeah, one last book that I read. I forgot about it. I read Bloodlust and Bonnets. I read it for Monsterathon, for like classic horror thing. And this is from Emily McGovern. It's a graphic novel. Emily McGovern is the Instagram for Background Slytherin. She has a webcomic for this, and it's basically a lot of shenanigans and fun. It's like a little character who's supposed to be like a background Slytherin, who is in the background of all the different exciting things happening in Harry Potter. Really entertaining. Love her Instagram. We'll link it down below. So funny. This one fell flat for me. This is her first original work. This is a like Regency novel or graphic novel with Lord Byron, and they're supposed to be kind of hunting vampires. But for me, Emily's biggest strength is taking like a classic that we know and love, for example Harry Potter, and then dialing all the characters up to 11 and playing with the kind of canon of that kind of literature, and then playing around with it and making like light of it, and playing with our expectations and things like that. So when you then remove that pre-existing framework that she's playing with, for example in her own work, I just don't think it worked very well. I found it very dull in place. Yet there just wasn't really much to it, and I didn't find it funny, which is a real shame because I was really looking forward to this. I would say please do check out Emily's Instagram down below. It is hilarious. I love Background Slytherin. I share it with some of my mates all the time. I think it's incredible. I love all of her characters. I just wouldn't recommend this one. So maybe like if you wanted to support her on her Patreon, where you do get to see a lot of the like background things and more stuff from that world. I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying this book. And now we're done. Are we done? It's because I didn't write it in here. I have to write it in my book journal. Do you want to see? Look, book journal. Yay! So yeah, so that is it from me. This has been my September reading wrap up. Have a wonderful reading week, and I will chat to you soon. Bye!